Kia ora and welcome to Sector Report and a look at the ever-expanding organics sector. We meet a Californian genetic engineering campaigner, Professor Pamela Ronald. She believes organic farming and genetic engineering can coexist, a theory which has the organic industry up in arms. It was an interesting interview. The professor has obviously continually been questioned about her views and is very adept at not answering questions directly. Certainly that was my experience. I also talked to one of her harshest critics, Stefan Browning of the Soil Health Association Organics New Zealand. And reporter Drew Chappell visits an organic dairy farm in the Waikato to see how the long-established operation has thrived and prospered. But first up, genetic engineering champion Professor Pamela Ronald.
I'm a scientist, so I go for science-based evidence, and I think it's critically important to use the best science when dissecting these kinds of issues, because sustainability is critical for life on this planet into the future. We need to go feeding from 7.2 billion to 9 billion people, and we need to reduce the harmful inputs in the environment. So I'm sort of technology neutral. Let's just use whatever works, and I think farmers need the ability to choose what farming system works for them. An organic farmer might want to grow organically, but their neighbor might want to reduce the amount of fertilizers in the environment. There may be a new genetically engineered crop that has higher nitrogen use efficiency, for clover, for example. And from an environmental standpoint, it would be foolish not to adopt that seed for the sake of the global community and the local community.
Yes, but there would appear to be a danger that genetically altered genes can find themselves in conventional seeds. For instance, I believe in the Midwest there's been a sample of alfalfa seeds done which showed that 12% of conventionally bred alfalfa seeds had actually taken on the characteristics of genetically altered organisms.
It's the issue of coexistence which is really important. How can a farmer who wants to grow organically coexist with somebody that's growing genetically engineered crops, and how can those two systems coexist? So it's been quite successful in the United States, this type of coexistence. You can never rule out some type of pollen flow, but it's usually very small, and certainly for a crop like alfalfa, which usually is grown and then fed to the animals, it's not like it's getting into the seed. So there's something called foundation seed. I'm not sure what you call it in New Zealand, but these are farms dedicated to growing the seed. And that's where you really want to be sure the seed is a high quality, and usually those types of seed industries want a 99% purity.
You give the example of genetically engineered cotton crops reducing the use of insecticides by half, but there are reports from India, for instance, that pests like the pink bollworm are developing resistance to pesticides used on GE crops.
Anytime you use an insecticide at high dosage or an herbicide at high dosage, you're going to select for resistance. And that's something that breeders and farmers have been dealing with for 100 years. And actually, the first resistance to BT occurred on a conventional farm where they were spraying BT like organic farmers do. So it's not, it is definitely something that has to be looked at. And this is what we talk a lot about in our book, because you can't just rely on a seed to change, to transform the farming system. The farming practices are very important. And what entomologists and breeders and farmers have shown in Arizona is that if you have an integrated management approach where you mix a genetic diversity in the field, so genetically engineered seed and seed that's not genetically engineered, it sort of provides refuges for the insects, so it reduces the selection pressure. And this turns out to be quite critical, because exactly as you said, in India, where there were not those refuges, their insects start to evolve resistance. And in Arizona, where there's been you can say a more organic approach, although organic farming does not allow, I should make clear, does not allow genetically engineered seed, but using the approach of crop genetic diversity and crop rotation, it has slowed the evolution of insect resistance, and it's been very robust. So farmers there have seen are now talking about possibly eradicating the insect completely, but not only by using genetically engineered seed. It's this combination of approaches.
Well, various interests from the organic sector have put out a release saying they were amazed at your Royal Society presentation, in which you mixed the terminology of conventional breeding techniques and GE techniques to say they were essentially the same. Now, that's their perception. How are they essentially the same when in the eyes of most New Zealanders they're mutually exclusive?
Yeah, I think they misinterpreted that. I made very clear, I actually had a slide showing the difference between genetic engineering and conventional breeding. So conventional breeding is actually a whole gamish of techniques. There is something called hybridization, which you may be familiar with, which is taking two different genetic stocks, cross-pollinating them, taking the hybrid and planting it. And that can be certified organic.
But that's as old as agriculture, really, isn't it?
Well, no, it's only about 100 years old. And some farmers don't like it because they have to go back to the seed company every year. If you try to replant hybrid seed and collect the next generation, you don't have the same characteristics. So farmers have to go back to the company. So that's one technique. I also talked about mutagenesis, which is you take, you can either irradiate seed or use a very toxic chemical to induce mutations into the seed. And then the breeder will then select for those seedlings that have the traits they want and then use that for breeding. And that introduces many random changes that are not characterized, and it's been quite successful. But the risk of unintended consequences is quite high with that technique, as you can imagine, because it's random mutation. You don't really know what genes you're hitting. That technique can also be certified organic. So the genetic engineering is you take a single gene and you place it precisely into the genetic makeup. That gene can be from the same species, that's what I do in my lab, a rice gene into a rice plant, or it can be from another species, for example, a bacterial gene into a rice plant. And so that's considered genetic engineering. So I tried to make that clear in the talk.
But as soon as scientists start actually manipulating genes, that's when the population becomes suspicious of the scientists.
So I also had a slide showing the 10,000 years of genetic manipulation, and there was primitive sort of saving the seed and replanting, and then nothing happened for, well, maybe it's 12,000 years, and then nothing happened for about 11,800 years, and then we had Mendelian genetics, and that really is where the change is, rapid advancements, and none of it is can be considered natural.
Yes, people will accept Mendelian genetics. It's been around a long time, and I guess you can call it selective breeding, which we have had for many years. But once scientists start manipulating genes in the laboratory and then they come into commercial production, really you've let the genie out of the bottle, haven't you, as far as the public perception is concerned?
I gave this example in my talk where I wrote down everything I ate Saturday, and we had rice and risotto, and we had nectarines, and we had cheese, and cheese is made from genetically engineered rennet. The beer is made from random mutation, like I told you, and that also is really quite new. It's only about 50 years old. The wine is made from grafted rootstocks where you're putting two species together. The only thing we ate that was not genetically altered was the fish caught from the sea. So kawai and John Dory and snapper. And so I understand that people have sort of tuned into what breeders are doing, and the idea of moving genes around seems quite alarming, but everything we eat has been genetically altered in some way, not genetically engineered, but genetically altered in some way.
Professor Pamela Ronald there, providing a glimpse into the controversial world of genetic engineering. Next up, Sector Report correspondent Drew Chappell takes us on a visit to what organic farming experts say is one of the most successful and long-established organic dairy farms in this country.
Just near the surfing paradise of Raglan, in the shadow of Meridian's brand new wind farm, lies a green jewel in the crown of New Zealand farming. Mike Moss and Madeline Rixtrot run 130 dairy cows on their Waitatuna Valley property, along with some 300 breeding ewes and 70-odd beef cattle. Like all Kiwi farmers, of course, they face many challenges, but unlike most, they have to do it without help from most of the chemical disease and weed controls available these days. Mike has been farming since he was 16, but 11 years ago made the tough decision to go fully organic.
I got to a point with the farming, we were trying to pressurise it. There was pressure from the industry at the time, or the industry direction was to increase stocking rates, carry more animals, produce more milk, bring in more inputs, and we were trying to do that on a difficult farm. And yes, we were growing more grass, we'd use the urea and what have you, we grew more grass, but that grass wasn't balanced, so then we'd spend a whole lot of money, buying magnesium or getting the vets out to fill the cows up with seeders to get them to cycle. We were still doing a bit of induction. We were using acidic fertilisers, which then had to be counteracted with lime and what have you. So while we were doing quite good production, the cost of getting that production was too high. So the result at the end of the day was actually very disappointing, while you had man and beast and farm under pressure. And I started looking at what was happening on organics, looking for a better way.
Mike was inspired by several farms already on the newly formed organic bandwagon as the movement started to take off in the late 90s.
The farms looked great, the animals were doing very, very well, and these farms were profitable. The operators were enjoying what they were doing, and I thought, yeah, that's where I want to be.
And do you see yourself as a bit of an inspiration to others who might be looking to get into it?
Well, we hope so. We're inspiration to ourselves in a way, because we're actually really enjoying our farming like never before. But if others get some messages or some inspiration out of that, that's a bonus. But we're certainly very happy with where we are, and you certainly wouldn't be going back to the old ways.
Mike says his stock, waterways and soil have never been in better shape, but the first few years were another story altogether. So you've been organic for 11 years. What was the transition like?
The first 2 or 3 years when you're in the conversion period was the toughest. You were neither in one camp or the other. The biological system hadn't really kicked in, yet you didn't have the tools that you would have had under the conventional system. So that transition phase was probably the toughest. And then after 3 or 4 years and the system kicked along, it became very easy.
Along with farming, Mike and assistant farm manager Matt Minoprio grow their own vegetables, keep a hive of bees, and run more than 30 hectares of exotic forestry, as well as a couple of blocks of natives. They also have an impressive biological pasture system set up, mixing their own recycled fertiliser. Assistant manager Matt showed me how their cowpat pit works.
They're very simple to make. It's just fresh cow manure mixed with basalt rock dust and ground up eggshells. So you've got the calcium in there and a whole lot of minerals from the rock dust. What they're all about really is forming a very biologically rich product to put in some of the biodynamic brews that we spray out on the land there.
Is it quite a unique setup, or is this common?
It's a staple in biodynamic farming. The Vinters down in Otago, actually, it's one of their mainstays of their systems. They're making huge quantities of it, and it's working very well for them in the biodynamic vineyards in Otago. But it's a very simple thing to do, and it's quite effective.
And this is all you need. This is all.
Yeah. Like you can see, it's not high tech.
Like most organic dairy farmers, Mike has high praise for the country's biggest company, Fonterra, and their efforts to promote the organic movement. He says for someone starting out in the industry, organics is now a sensible choice, not a step into the unknown.
Fonterra even pay a premium during the conversion process, which is really smart. That's a huge help. They have support people in place. There's an organic discussion group. There's other organic educators in the industry that are doing a great job, and you've got a much greatly increased farmer network of knowledge, if you like. So yeah, it's a whole lot easier. Having said that, the rules have also changed a bit. The goalposts keep shifting, but the support network and the financial support is certainly a whole lot easier.
And at boardroom level, the cooperative has signalled a change to its organic strategy, both on farm and off. Over the course of this story, we approached Fonterra several times with the hope of getting an interview about their organic milk strategy. They declined the opportunity, but sent through a statement which reads in part, "At this point, Fonterra has a high level of organic farms in transition that will meet the planned growth over the next 2 to 3 years. While Fonterra is committed to its organic business, current demand for organic milk is being serviced by existing suppliers. At this stage, the volume of organic milk we collect is growing within our contracted supply base." Several farmers we spoke to who did not wish to be named, though, told us that Fonterra has indicated to them they're changing the way they pay the premium for organic milk. Currently, it sits at 20% above the payout, but that's going to be changed to a solid figure of $1.05. At current levels, that represents a drop of about 7.5%. And of course, standing in the way of organic conversion for most average farmers is the bottom line: cost. A lot of time and money goes into changing the way the land and resources are managed. And then, of course, there's capital investment too. A sizable herd home like this one on Mike and Madeline's property will set you back around about $200,000. A fairly large investment, but one they say is well worth it during one of Raglan's famously wet winters. Incredibly, around here in the winter months, they measure rainfall in the metres. But despite the challenges of nature and red tape, ask organic proponents if they'd swap places with another farmer and you'll get a similar response. Would you ever go back to the way it was before?
Never, no.
Why? Why not?
Why would you? I mean, yeah, you go from stress city to thoroughly enjoying what you're doing.
Welcome back. Next joining me here in the studio is Stefan Browning of the Soil Health Association, who responds to the views of Professor Pamela Ronald. Hi Stefan, and welcome to Sector Report here on Country 99 TV. Now, you've seen my edited interview with Professor Pamela Ronald. What did you make of it?
I found it very typical of Pamela Ronald. I went to her presentation at the Royal Society. I've heard her on Radio New Zealand with a reasonably long interview there, and in fact some of her responses are very off-pat, exactly the same and just as incorrect as each time. Yes.
Yeah, I heard the Radio New Zealand one with Kim Hill, and even Kim Hill didn't seem to get a hell of a lot out of it, did she? No,
I thought it was interesting the way she questioned her, but of course you'll notice that Pamela Ronald will skip and dodge particular questions. You talk about safety, she's will just say, oh look, we really need to focus on this and that sort of thing. She'd skip around the stage at the Royal Society, dodging these sort of things in a very physical way as well. And she had a PowerPoint, and she had a number of examples of different crops or whatever, and it would be genetically altered, next one, genetically altered, next one, genetically altered, about 5 or 6 of those, and then she slipped in a genetically modified, and then she went back to genetically altered, and then it started to compact after a while. You got genetically modified more often, and it was totally misleading to particularly lay people.
Quite a carefully thought out technique.
Oh, absolutely.
But she's one of several Americans, and now you've just shown me this report here by Terry Dunahay,
yes,
who's just been out here, and there's another Nina
Fedorov was here January last year.
Right.
Yes.
And these people are reporting back to the US Department of Agriculture about what's happening here with genetic engineering.
Yes.
What are they saying? And am I right in thinking there's actually a bit of a
There's a strategy.
A strategy, yes. Quite a strong interest in using genetic engineering here in New Zealand.
Yes, well, New Zealand's almost unique in the world that we haven't accepted GE crops out into the environment at this point. Well, in fact, we're very, very fortunate at the moment. We only have one active field test, and that's the one at Ag Research at Ruakura at the moment. The trees at Sion, I think, are likely to get planted soon, but we're we're very good, and for our markets that like the extra value, we're particularly good because we are GE-free. We're nuclear-free, we're GE-free, the 100% pure New Zealand thing fits very, very well.
Yeah, that's a great marketing tool.
It is, and it's been recognised, and there's like Professor Caroline Saunders from Lincoln, and those have identified the value of that internationally. So it is something, if we want to get away from commodities, we've got a very good marketing tool. In terms of the US, WikiLeaks even showed where the embassy's working on the government to say, hey, we want, we think you should be softening up both your regulatory issues around GE to make it easier to get in. The other thing they want us to do is to accept low-level contamination, so that because the growing of conventional or organic, it's not just organics, it's just people that want to do conventional growing, might be maize growers wanting to sell into Japan, but they don't want to have a skerrick of GE. They somehow would like us to accept coexistence and low-level contamination so that they can then bring in this flood of GE seed from the States.
I found it interesting that she seemed to me to be prepared to accept that there is a certain amount of pollen flow, I think they call it, is that the term?
Or gene flow.
Or gene flow from GE crops into conventional non-GE crops.
Yes.
And they seem to go, well, that's kind of, the collateral damage, I suppose, is the way I'd put it. And that seemed to be sort of accepted by those GE proponents?
Well, they need us to accept it for them to have their way with us, you might say. Very interesting that over in the States here, they've just had the alfalfa, lucerne that we're so familiar with here, be given the tick by the USDA after a lot of court cases, although it's gone back into court, I gather.
Oh, has it?
But they've got some quite significant areas under experimental growth, but it's like hundreds of hectares. And there's considerable leakage. And I noticed that you asked her about that. In New Zealand here, we have a lot of good base, genetic material in alfalfa that we could have a thriving in-house alfalfa industry that we do not need to import one more seed of it from overseas. Now, Phil Geertsen, who is one of the people that have taken them to court over in the States, where he's a seed producer, he also produces seed in New Zealand, and he said we do not need to bring another bit into here, and he says it's at great risk because, and he's done a fantastic report over there showing that leakage there. So here we have ryegrass and clover being intended to come into the New Zealand pastoral scene, and PGG Wrightson are very, very keen for that to happen. They're heavily involved with this, but they're waiting for sort of community acceptance of that into this country.
They won't get it though, will they?
Well, not if a number of people I know would have their way, and but it's a bit of concern that government has put $5 million into that program, just as they put $10 million into the GE trees. So they're putting a lot more into that than they are into, let's say, the organic sector, for example. So I think they won't be pushing it ahead of the election because they know that's such a contentious thing and it would not be seen as desirable. But I would suspect there'll be a fair bit of pressure soon after. After this election cycle.
I just want to get back to Pamela Ronald and this whole argument she has that genetic engineering and organics can coexist. Now, I'd have thought, in the eyes of most New Zealanders, the two would be mutually exclusive. What's your reaction to her argument?
Well, she's totally wrong, and I said it's the ultimate untruth, I think, and it is. We have, and I'm actually on the BioGrow board and on the certification committee, there's absolutely zero tolerance, just as New Zealand has a zero tolerance to the leakage of GE at the moment. Our standards are like that, and most standards of organics through the world are. Some governments have said you can still call it organic if it's 0.9% contaminated, but that's not what the consumers want. No. They want zero. It's not just a little bit.
It's a very black and white thing, isn't it?
Very, very much is. And so she's quite misleading, and her book and this thing, I've got an organic husband and these can coexist. No, they can't. Not on the consumer's point of view. Those two might think so, but that's about where it stops.
Stefan Browning of the Soil Health Association there. And that's our program. I'll be back soon with another edition of Sector Report. Remember, you can catch up with the program on our website. See you next time.